Today we're going to get Abraham Lincoln because, well, let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Lincoln. He was 6'4". He was the tallest president we've ever had. Several of them got to 6'2" and 6'3", but he's the only one that got to 6'4", and he weighed 165 pounds. He looked like a good stiff sneeze would have blown him apart. He really did. And yet, he had abnormally large hands and abnormally large feet and very narrow shoulders. And nobody knew it at the time, but it's been diagnosed since then that he was suffering what became known of as Marfan syndrome. What that means is you've got a heart valve problem, and your heart is not constantly pumping enough blood, and so as you're growing very long and tall and thin, and your limbs are just uniquely shaped. And he had huge hands. When people would come up and shake his hand, they would often comment that their hand seemed to disappear inside of his hand. His hand was that big. And he was just abnormally strong. And part of that was from growing up the way he did, and I will tell you quite a bit about that. But part of it was because of this ailment. He died at the age of 56. Had he lived to the age of 60, he probably would have died then because of the stress of Marfan syndrome. And so there's just all kinds of unique things about him, and I'm going to be telling you a lot about some of those unique things. Okay, but as is true about him, and it's true about all of us, our story doesn't start with us. Our story starts with our parents. It starts with our families extended back. This is thought to be a picture of his mother. Thought to be? He was 9 when she died. 9. Okay? She died from milk sickness. Milk sickness is when cows go out and graze and they find a poisonous milkweed and they don't know the difference and they eat it anyway. And then as it is digesting through their system and making milk, and then when people drink that milk, they will get extremely sick and often will die. She died. She had, by that time when she died, she'd given birth to 3 children, and Abraham was the middle of the 3. He was the oldest boy. There was a girl and then 2 boys, and he was the middle child of the kids. And she encouraged him to learn to read and enjoy learning. I need to tell you something else about him. When you walked into first day of 2nd grade, by that day you now have more education, formal education, than he had his whole life. That was all the formal education he had. This is a man who could quote the Bible, he could quote Dante, he could quote Chaucer, he could quote Sir Thomas Gray, and I'll give you an example of that in this presentation. He was extremely well read. But formal education didn't have very much at all. Why? Because his father was convinced that education was a complete and total waste of time. And made it very clear that after 1 year of education, that was enough. And pulled him out of school and put him to work. Okay, now we rudely started before you got here. I apologize. I'm sorry. Anyway, thank you for coming. Now, I can't imagine watching and helping my father make my mother's coffin. I can't even fathom that. And he did. He did. Now, as he was growing up, this is a very typical picture of what he looked like. He was often carrying an axe. Why? Because that was the business that his father helped do to make money. They would go they came into a business called clearing land. What that meant was you have just come into a big piece of land and you've bought a big piece of land and there's all kinds of trees, which is fine, but you want some of the trees taken out so you can build a home and you can start planting the land. You will bring in the Lincolns. And what they will do is they will start chopping down the trees and they will start tearing up the stumps. And when the trees fall, they will start skinning the trees, and then they will put wedges in them and break them open, and then break them open again, because you're trying to make exterior shaping for a housing, for roofs, and you're trying to, if you want 2x4s or 4x6s or 4x8s, you're going to have to cut them out of these trees, out of these big long logs. Where in the heck was Home Depot? It would have been so much simpler. But that's what they did. And everybody that heard Lincoln as a young man doing this often thought that there was 4 and 5 men in the forest cutting down trees, because he swung so hard and so fast, and the sound of the axe hitting that log, those trees, was so hard and just loud that everybody was convinced it had to be several men doing this. And then they would go in and find out it was one teenage boy. He was abnormally strong very early in his life and did a great work. The other part of this picture that is very important is he's holding a book. His father often told him, reading and education is a complete waste of time. And his mother often told him, you can never read enough, and helped instill a love of learning in his world. And people that often knew him throughout his life, what they remember is he would go up to them and after getting acquainted, do you have any books that I could borrow? Do you have any magazines that I could borrow? Anything to read? He was constantly borrowing and reading and would turn them back to you. And he just absolutely loved the process of gaining knowledge. Now, as he is growing up, he moves away from his father because he and his father never did get along. Later on, in the presidency in the White House, one of his aides came up to him and said, Mr. Lincoln, we have now heard that your father has passed away. And Lincoln looked at him and said, to me, my father died a long time ago. And that was it. And they never did have much of a very good relationship. Now, as he is continuing to grow, he had an opportunity as a like 18, 19 years old. He had an opportunity to go down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. And while there, he got to see a slave auction. And I need to tell you just a little bit about a slave auction and how disgusting it was. Because people that would come to purchase slaves, be a large crowd of people, and then they would bring in the slaves and they would put them up on a stand, something like tables, and they would strip all the clothing off of the potential slaves. And because you want to see several things. First of all, you want to see on a woman, you want to see her backside. It's thought if she has wide hips, she will probably be able to give birth easily. You want to keep women slaves pregnant constantly, because every slave that is born is a free slave to you. You didn't have to purchase that. I hope that sounds as disgusting to you as it does to me. In looking at men, you want to look at their shoulders, their upper arms, and their back. The shoulders and arms to see if they're strong and they can do a lot of work. The back, you want to see the scar content. Is there lots of scars on there? And if there are, you can get that slave for very cheaply, but you're going to have to keep a whip handy to keep beating them, because that's how they got their scars. They're not working hard enough and fast enough. Lincoln took one look at all of that and decided forever that this is terrible and this is wrong. And for the rest of his life was against slavery. I've always loved this quote about slavery by Lincoln. Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it. How true. And what a wonderful, wonderful concept. One of the other things that Lincoln got involved with is he found a series of books called the Blackstone's Commentaries. What the heck is that? That is the series of books you read so that you can prepare yourself to go take a test to become a lawyer. Today, we go to college, get a 4-year degree, then we go to 3 years for law school, and then we go take those humongous tests that last forever, and many people will flunk various parts, and you have to go back and take the parts that you flunked to become a lawyer. He read the books and took the test and passed and became a lawyer. I include this picture because I love the hair. Would you leave a picture like that out there with your hair going? It looks like he stuck his finger into a light socket. Unbelievable. About this time in his mid-20s, he started to become acquainted with a young lady. And her name was Anne Rutledge. And they dated and got very serious and talked about marrying and moving forward in their life and where they were going to live and what they were going to do and all of the things that we talk about at that stage in our life and the conversations that we have. And there was only one small problem, and that is she had a persistent cough. And finally, they went to a doctor to find out what is going on, because she just couldn't seem to get rid of this cough. And the doctor gave her all kinds of exams to try and figure out what it was, and came back and sat the couple down and said, I need to tell you that she has consumption. Today, we call that tuberculosis. She died 3 months later. And it absolutely just fractured his world. And this is the first time, although it probably happened after the death of his mother, this is the first time that we know of that he went into a state of mind that he always called his mental blackness or darkness. We call it depression. And he struggled with depression. He really did. And losing someone like that at that stage in a relationship, that would be devastating. Absolutely devastating.
How old was she?
They were both in their, she was 22 or 23, and he was just a little bit older than that. 25 or 26, right in there, mid-20s. Okay. A couple of things about Anne Rutledge. She is buried in New Salem, Illinois, and some kind soul has come about the last 15 years and redone her gravestone. And this is what's written on the back of the gravestone. It's a quote from Mr. Lincoln. I cannot bear to think of her out there alone in the storm. He genuinely loved her, and it absolutely rocked his world when she passed away. We wouldn't know a lot about her until the first decade of the 1900s, and a writer from Illinois, a man by the name of Edgar Lee Masters, wrote a book. And that book is called Spoon River Anthology. That is a delightful book. And what it is, it's all gravestone stories. And you read the gravestones, and then you try to figure out the relationship of everyone in the town. And one of the citizens of the town is Anne Rutledge. And Mr. Edgar Lee Masters, wrote about Anne Rutledge, and this is what he said about her. Out of me, unworthy and unknown, the vibrations of deathless music, with malice toward none, with charity toward all. Out of me, forgiveness of millions toward millions, and the beneficent face of a nation shining with justice and truth. I am Anne Rutledge, who sleep beneath these weeds, beloved of Abraham Lincoln, wedded to him, not through union, but through separation. Bloom forever, O Republic, from the dust of my bosom. they never had the chance to get married, and he took care of her until the day she died. And it is just a heartbreaking part of his story. It really, really is.
Does anyone know whose words those are?
That was written by Edgar Lee Masters as part of that book, Spoon River Anthology. Okay? All right. 2 or 3 years later, he was a functioning attorney in Springfield, and he went to a dance one summer afternoon. And all of a sudden, a young woman walked in that he had never seen before. Her name was Mary Todd. She was from Kentucky, and she had a sister that happened to live there. Come right over here. That's just fine. There we go. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. Now, they attended several dances that summer and got acquainted and spent time together. And then she went back to her family in Kentucky. And they started writing letters back and forth and communicating and doing all of those things that we do when we're in love. And then came the opportunity of him to go to Kentucky to meet her family for the first time. That's always an interesting process, isn't it? It really, really is an eye-opening process. And he went there and spent time with them, and they spent time with him and talked to him. And then they came back privately to her and said, he seems like a nice enough guy. He's got some prospects because he's an attorney. However, you can't marry him. He has no family. He has no heritage. He has no culture. No, he has no prospects. He's not going to amount to anything. You can't marry him. Both of her parents died before the Lincolns got to the White House. I've often wondered what they would have thought, because the Todds were guilty of something that many of us are all guilty of. We all should have giant leg muscles from jumping to conclusions, right? Are we ever guilty of jumping to conclusions? Unfortunately, we are, and it's really too bad, but we do that. We do that. And they married, and they ended up having 4 sons, and it was quite an interesting life together. In the 1840s, after they'd married in about 46, 43, 44, 45, right in there, in 1846, he got elected to the United States House of Representatives and got sent to Washington, D.C. as a representative of Illinois. And during that time is about the time when the Mexican War broke out. And President Polk demanded to get a declaration of war because Mexican soldiers had crossed the Rio Grande River, and American soldiers had crossed the Texas River, and there had been some shooting back and forth. And Polk said, American blood was shed on American soil, and we want to go to war. And everybody loved the concept, except one Illinois representative who said, show me the blood where blood was shed, American blood was shed on American soil. The media went nuts against Lincoln because he wasn't patriotic. He didn't support a very popular war. And in 1848, he was quickly voted out of office. And he was convinced when he left Washington, D.C., that he was never coming back to Washington, D.C., and he was just fine with that. Aren't we glad that didn't turn out to be true? Now, he goes home and he has to make a living. Okay. He starts writing circuit. You know what that is? That is, you get 2 other attorneys, so there's 3 of you. And for about 4 to 6 months a year, you get on your horses and you start looping through, and if this is the state of Illinois, You literally start riding through all kinds of little towns, and you'll come into the town, and you'll pick up all the court cases from the last time you were there, and one will be the prosecution, one will be the attorney, and one will be the judge. And they will listen to you and figure out your case, and they'll present it to the judge. And the judge will rule, and that's it. And you are done. And they did very, very well. Except, nobody has any money. It's a barter system. So, what would happen? Throughout the decade of the 1850s, Mrs. Lincoln would be home in Springfield. All of a sudden, there's a knock at the door. She'd go open the door. There's a man she's never seen before. Hi, I'm Mr. Whatever, and I'm from Ottawa, Illinois, or wherever. Your husband helped me win a court case. Here's a cow. Here's 450 pounds of potatoes. Here's 2 horses. You never knew what you were going to get, because that's how they paid their bills. She must have been really good on Amazon selling all this stuff, and trying to. I mean, you're going to use 450 pounds of apples? Well, that's a lot of apple pies, people. But what an interesting thing. And they did very, very well. They must have done well, because in the 1850s, the Lincolns doubled the size of their house. Now, you know enough about building and construction and house costs, and you don't just randomly double the size of your house. No, you know you're going to have some money involved, and they doubled the size of their house. They did very well. He was doing fine, and then all of a sudden, in 1857, his world and the world of America changed because of a court case. The man on your left is Dred Scott. Dred Scott is a slave owned by Dr. John Emerson. John Emerson is a doctor, and he decides one day he's going to go out west and make a lot of money because there's no medical care out there, and he can charge what he wants, and he took his slave with him, and they did make a lot of money, and they were gone for 2 or 3 years, and Dr. Emerson turned Dred Scott into what today we would call a nurse practitioner, and he ended up helping a lot, and everything was going fine, and all of a sudden one day Dr. Emerson got sick and died. And Dred Scott helped bury him and came back and said, I have lived in free country. My owner has freed me. I am free. And Dr. Emerson's family said, no, wrong. And they filed a court case against Dred Scott saying, you weren't owned by him, you were owned by the family, and you're still a slave. And this court case went clear to the Supreme Court. The man on the right is Chief Justice Roger Taney. If you look up in the dictionary the word racist, you're going to see a picture of this man. He is a blatant racist. The idea that any black man would ever even think about possibly becoming free under any circumstances is so far out of the realm of his world, that's not going to happen. Ever. And he ruled against Dred Scott. In doing that, he also undid the Compromise of 1820, the Compromise of 1850. He helped create the Kansas-Nebraska Bloody Kansas problems. He did all kinds of things because he is such a blatant racist and set back possible evolution of civil rights for a long, long ways. The only good to come out of all of that, it got an Illinois attorney interested in politics again. Now, in 1858, this man, Stephen Douglas, is a United States Senator. He's been a senator. He's 3-term senator. He's loved being a senator. However, he no longer wants to be a senator. He wants to run to become president in 1860. But it's 1858. You got to stay a senator for a couple more years to keep your name in public. And so he's running again. And all of a sudden, and he's a Democrat, and all of a sudden the brand new Republican Party comes up with a fairly well-known candidate, an attorney who's well-known and talks well. And they began a series of debates that took place from early September through the end of October in 1858. These debates were so well known that media came from Boston and New York and Philadelphia. They brought people out there to cover the debates. And it was incredible because you got two incredibly well-known, very articulate, well-educated people who know the subjects of the matter of the time. And you can go back and read the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and you'll be surprised at how well thought out they are. They really are. But what's interesting is Lincoln, again, is 6'4", 165 pounds. Douglas is about 5'2" in height and width. They look like the number 10 standing next to each other. Okay? Now, and Douglas was arguing for slavery and popular sovereignty, but I love Lincoln's response. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. You like slavery? Why don't you go volunteer to become a slave and see what the experience is like? Have any of us ever heard of anybody doing that? No. And what a great response. What happened in the election of 1858 is Douglas ended up winning. Just before the election, voting took place. Douglas went to Springfield, talked to some of his friends, got a border exception, and created more possibilities of him getting more votes, and won the election. He was not about to lose it under any circumstances. He was not going to lose it. Fast forward 2 years to 1860, and Douglas is now running for the presidency. Because of the senatorial debates and how well Lincoln did, the Republican Party came to Lincoln and said, we want you to come to New York. We want to spend time with you. We want to prepare you because you're going to become the Republican candidate in the 1860 presidential election. And Lincoln did. What is really fascinating is those people put him in front of newspaper reporters on a regular basis, so he got used to talking in that kind of a realm. And newspaper reporters aren't always, shall we kindly say, the most kind and gentle people involved. But one of the questions of Lincoln at that time was, Mr. Lincoln, tell us about your family and your heritage. And then Mr. Lincoln smiled with that enigmatic smile of his and looked at them and said, the story of my family is the story of, and then he quotes, the short and simple annals of the poor. That is a quote out of Thomas Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard. Lincoln quoted a 16th century British poet. That's pretty darned impressive. That really, really is. And that poem's wonderful, by the way. But anyway, he did a great job. He ran against, in the 1860 presidential election, ran against some very powerful interests, incredibly important people who were definitely expected to win, but they had what we call baggage. And he didn't have any. And so he gets nominated and he gets elected. If that part of the story is remotely interesting at all, I would highly recommend this book by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It's entitled Team of Rivals, or anything by Doris Kearns Goodwin. She is magnificent. She really, really is. And if you may, because this book tells us about the story of this 1860 presidential election and how he defeated all those candidates, he then took them, after he's elected, he brought all of them into his cabinet and gave them jobs in his cabinet. It kind of reminds you of the Mark Twain quote where Mark Twain said, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Great book. If you remember, about 5 years ago, there was a movie that Steven Spielberg brought out called Lincoln. Wonderful movie. They used 50 pages out of this book for that movie. Phenomenal stories. She's amazing. She's well worth reading. Okay, now, he wins the election. In March of 1861, he's traveling from Springfield to Washington, D.C. On the way, he pulls out his iPhone and calls to a little town in Ohio because he's telling the train, you got to stop because we're going to meet a little girl and her family. This little girl's name is Grace Bledel. She was an 11-year-old girl. She had written him a letter during the campaign, and she said, Mr. Lincoln, you're kind of homely, and you'd look a whole lot better if you'd grow a beard. And if you'd grow a beard, mothers and wives everywhere would talk their husbands into voting for you. You need to grow a beard. All of our pictures are of Lincoln with a beard. He had never had facial hair before. And after the election, he grew out a beard, and they stopped in that little bitty town. He got off the train. He brought the family up. He told the town of the story and thanked them, and then got back on the train. The statue is in that little town in Ohio where she was from. And then he went on to Washington, D.C. Now, when he got to Washington, D.C., one of the first things he ran into was a little bit of a problem. 8 states had left or seceded from the Union, which eventually, obviously, as we all know, morphs into the Civil War. Okay. One of the first things that happened is he gets a letter from the commandant of Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is on a little bitty island off the coast of South Carolina. South Carolina is a Confederate state. You've got a Union fort right on the edge of a Confederate state that has now run out of supplies. They write him a letter and say, can you please send us some supplies? Before he did, he wrote a letter to the mayor of that little town and to the governor of South Carolina and said, my people need supplies. They need food, they need medical supplies, they need care. And I'm going to be sending it. A letter came back from the governor of South Carolina, said, if you send anything, we will view that as an act of war, and we will immediately respond. And so he sent supplies. And they barricaded the little island around so that the supplies could not get in, and a cannonade shooting back and forth lasted for about 18 hours, and 1 donkey was killed. And then when the fort went to surrender and pull down the flag, they shot off their cannons to do that. The cannons inadvertently exploded, killing 3 American soldiers, or Union soldiers, who thus became the first deaths of the Civil War, which is kind of crazy. By the middle into the end of July, giant armies had gathered in southeastern Virginia to a place called the McLean Farm. Wilmer McLean owns the farm. He is really, really upset because they have brought armies to his farm. He's a pacifist. He hates war. After the Battle of Bull Run, which was fought on his farm, he sold his farm and moved west to get away from the war and bought another farm in Appomattox, Virginia. The war started on his farm and it ended at his kitchen table, which is absolutely unbelievable. And if we start giving too much detail about the various battles, we're going to be here till at least 10 o'clock, and I don't know that that should be a problem at all for any of us, should it? Good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mindy's going, yeah, right. Okay, anyway. It is a very interesting battle because of people involved. One of the people was this man. His name was Thomas Jackson. Mr. Jackson had been a big war hero in the Mexican War and had come home. Well, now what am I going to do? He started teaching school at Virginia Military Institute and was okay at that. And that's fine. And then in 1861, he's going to resign and go join the Confederate Army. And he tells the school that. And as soon as the graduating class, about to graduate class, hears about that, they come to him and say, no, whoa. You can't do that. You have to wait until the end of the school year so we can graduate, and then we will go with you, and we will go fight in that battle. And so he said, okay, I can do that. That's fine. And so he did. He waited And the 80 members of the graduating class did graduate. And then they all went with him, and they joined the Confederate Army, and they all fought in the First Battle of Bull Run. This is a picture of Mr. Jackson. And on the second day, his horse jumped over the front lines, and the voice behind him almost screamed out, and he is moving his horse, and if this is the Union Army, he's got his horse this way, and he's turning this way in his saddle, almost taunting them to try and shoot him. And the voice behind the battlefield, behind the lines, screamed out and said, General Bernard B. said, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginian, boys." And forever after, he is known as Stonewall Jackson. And that's where it comes from, because he was brave beyond belief and an incredible soldier. Let's go back to the Lincolns just briefly. The Lincolns, as I said, had 4 sons. One little boy died in the early 1850s at the age of 2, and that would be heartbreaking. And so the couple, the family, the parents, vowed to spend a lot of time with their children, trying to just be around them at all times, and did a pretty good job. And then their youngest son, William Wallace Lincoln, at the age of 11 in 1862, got sick in the White House and died. That absolutely just shook their world. It really did. Mrs. Lincoln never again appeared in public not wearing black. I've often wondered about the name here. Do you remember about 15, 20 years ago, a movie came out that Mel Gibson starred as a Scotland person who would be our equivalent to George Washington, but he helped Scotland become free, and his name was William Wallace. Now, did Lincoln know that? Or did Lincoln just randomly put those names? I don't know. I have no idea. But I've always thought that that is just so interesting. So I keep sending emails to alincoln.com or any other name I can come up with, and so far he hasn't answered my question. I don't know what the problem is. But that really, really hurt the family. In early 1863, this woman was invited to come to a White House dinner. When you're invited to a White House dinner, you get a beautiful invitation, and it has your name on it, and if they know who you're going to bring, like if you're married and they know that, and you're going to bring your spouse, they'll put their name there, or they'll just write and guest. And when you come, you have to bring that piece of paper. And you will come into a door, and you will get in the line, and the president and his wife will be standing here. There'll be a man standing right behind the president. That man's job is to whisper in the president's ear, "This is Mr. and Mrs. Jones. This is Mr. and Mrs." So the president can greet you by name, so it appears that the president knows everybody. Yeah, right. That's just not possible. Anyway, her and her husband were invited to come. Her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her husband is a well-known minister named Calvin. And they were invited to come, and they got in line, and they got right up to Mr. Lincoln. Lincoln is 6'4", she is 5'2", but she was wearing slight heels, and so she was a little bit taller. And he reached over and took her hand and said, "Oh, you're the little lady who started this great big war." Because she had written the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now, but the line keeps moving. She has to keep going. She went to her death several years later, never did know whether he was serious or not. Had no idea. This statue is in the cemetery in Connecticut where she is buried. And what an incredible little story. Lee and Jackson knew, because the British had contacted them and said, "If you will win one major battle in the North, we will recognize the Confederacy as a separate country. And if that ever happens, we are forever two countries, the United States of America and the Confederate States of America." And all they needed to do was win one battle in the North. And before they headed north for that battle, they fought a battle that has become known as the Battle of Chancellorsville, on May the 1st and 2nd and 3rd of 1863. At that battle, Lee took his entire Southern army, divided it in half, and attacked the North on both sides. The North was convinced that somehow overnight the Southern army had doubled. And they never did figure it out, and the South won. And it's considered a brilliant tactical maneuver. But the night before the last day of the battle, Jackson went out onto the field, and as he and his others are coming back, a sentry, and it started to get night, a sentry jumped up, and instead of calling out who goes there, pulled up his gun and shot a couple of times. The first bullet hit Jackson right here. The second bullet hit him up in here. They ended up having to cut off Jackson's arm in order to save his life. And that's why you see those horrible pictures in the Civil War of stacks outside medical tents of stacks of arms and legs, because they could cut off a limb and save the life. And it had everything to do with style of bullets. But anyway, they cut off his arm. They took the arm and buried the arm. Okay. 10 days later, Jackson died. They buried the body 100 miles away in a family cemetery. And in 1969, somebody with way too much time on their hands researched all this and found that the body was buried from the arm, separate from the arm, got legal permission, exhumed both graves, put the arm and the body back together, and buried them together. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. But anyway, Jackson ended up passing away of pneumonia. The bullets didn't kill him, but the pneumonia did. And Lee said, he lost his left arm. I have lost my right arm. Lee heads north because he still needs to win a battle in the north. They head toward a little bitty hole-in-the-wall city in southeast Pennsylvania. You might have heard of it. It's called Gettysburg. Why Gettysburg? They've got a shoe factory. Maybe the soldiers can get shoes. How important is that? Now, if we start in on Gettysburg, I'm not kidding you. We're going to be here for long hours, because whole books not only have been written about the battle, they've been written about each of the 3 days. And it's hugely, hugely important. And I'm going to tell you just little bits and pieces about it. On the first day, the South attacked the North, but they ran out of daylight. If they would have kept pushing, they could have controlled the city of Gettysburg very easily. Had they done that, they would have won the battle. Instead, it's night. We'll start tomorrow morning. And they backed up, and the North reinforced the city. On the second day, the South moved all the way around on the far end and attacked on this end. And I'm going to come back and tell you quite a bit about that. And then on the third day, the South attacked right in the center of the North lines. That is exactly the battle plans of Napoleon, because all of the generals had learned at West Point, and that's what you were taught. Smash them on the left side, smash them on the right side, and smash them right in the middle. And you could just hear Napoleon sitting up in military heaven cheering, but that was exactly how that was fought. Okay, now, let me tell you 2 brief stories. This one is John Burns. John Burns is a citizen of Gettysburg. And a couple of days before, about a day before the battle was to start, Burns shows up at the Union headquarters, banging on the door. And then they're not answering it quick enough. He pulls up his gun and just beating the door. And finally the soldiers come running. They don't even. This man is 75 years old. Yes, what can we help you with? Tell me where to stand. What? Tell me where to stand. What are you talking about? Them damn Rebs came to my town. That is unforgivable. You tell me where to stand, and I'm going to shoot them. He's holding a gun that's older than he is. They're not even sure the gun will work. And their answer, sir, we've been fighting now for 2.5 years. We got a pretty good army here. There's over 82,000 of us here. and we've got a pretty good idea of how to handle this. And thank you, but I think we're all... Son, you don't understand. He wouldn't take no for an answer. And they finally took him out on the front lines. Turns out the gun did work very well, because there was several dead Confederate bodies out in front of him. He got wounded. They bring him back. Fix him. Take me back. So they take him back. He keeps shooting, and the results are still good from his point of view. And he gets wounded again. They take him back. They fix him. Take me back. And they take him back out front. The third time, he got wounded very, very badly. They said, you're done. We cannot take you back out front. We're going to have to call your wife. She's going to have come. She's going to have to come get you. So they pulled out their iPhone and called into downtown Gettysburg. And, of course, his wife gets on the phone. Wouldn't have that been easier? And they told her, your husband has been wounded. You need to come and get him. You know what her response was? If that damned old fool was so stupid as to get himself shot, you keep him. I don't want him. And she wouldn't come get him. They ended up having to take 3 soldiers and a wagon, taking him back to Gettysburg to undo him. And you're going, whoa. But when you find his statue on Gettysburg Field, this is a man that loved his city, and he loved his country. And he was there in defense of everything that he stood for. And you begin to understand the personal level of commitment on both sides when you see something like that. You really do. This man's name is Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. Colonel Chamberlain is a college professor from Maine. He's always been considered the best educated person that ever fought in the Civil War because he could speak, read, and write 8 languages. Unbelievable. Brilliant man. And he wanted to become a soldier. And so he did. And I'm going to back up to show you where the effect he had. Before the start of the second day, they bring the 20th Maine down and they put him right there. And they say, you defend right there at Little Round Top. If the Southern Army gets around you, they're going to come right up the main road behind us, and they're going to kill us all, and we're going to lose the battle and likely the war. No pressure, okay? But don't you dare give up your ground. Okay. And so his men spread out and start responding, and the Confederates start charging, and this is when you start to hear the rebel yell, and that rebel yell sounds like screamed banshees and zombies coming up out of the depths of hell. It is unbelievable. And they start charging, and the shooting is going back and forth, and it goes up and down on that Little Round Top. And about 2 o'clock, there was a little bit of a lull. And Chamberlain calls all of his men, let me move it back now. Chamberlain calls all of his men back together and said, bring all of your bullets. So everybody brings their bullets, and they put them in a big pile, and they start dividing them up. Everybody gets 3. And that's all you've got. That's all there is. And everybody goes back, and then the charge starts again. And all of a sudden, you're hearing click, 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 click. And everybody knows your lifespan can now be measured in minutes. And the soldiers are looking around going, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And Chamberlain stands up and screams out, mount bayonets. And they look at him like he's lost his mind. And he screams again, mount bayonets. And so they stand up and they take out their bayonet and they put it on the end of their rifle. And then he screams, charge. And they all start running downhill at the Confederacy, and they are screaming. And the Confederacy looking up and see this massive onslaught of humanity with bayonets coming at them. Many dropped their guns and surrendered. And they ended up holding Little Round Top, and then they start gathering up all these Confederate soldiers as prisoners of war. Okay. And they start guarding them, and Chamberlain's walking around making sure everybody's okay. And he walks up to one of his men. The man is guarding about 30 different Confederate soldiers, and the man motions to Chamberlain, come here, come here, come here. Okay. And Chamberlain walks over to him, says, yes, And his soldier says to Chamberlain, "You see those soldiers over there I'm guarding?" And Chamberlain, yeah, I do. "I don't have any bullets in my gun." And Chamberlain looks up and looks at the soldiers and looks at his man and looks back and forth. And he turns to his man and says, "Don't tell him." Unbelievable. Chamberlain ends up winning the Congressional Medal of Honor because he held America together. Had he failed at that moment, we would be two countries, without a doubt. He is that big of a deal. He goes on and he's wounded at another major battle, and by the time he comes back, he's been promoted, and he receives the entire surrender of battle flags and arms of the Confederacy. And he has his Union soldiers line the road as the Confederates are walking down and demands that his Union soldiers stand at salute in honor of the Confederacy. Phenomenal individual. He really, really is. Okay, now, during that summer, a town of 3,000 has to deal with 53,000 dead and wounded. Any problem there? Oh, heavens, no. No, not at all. The United States government finally sends a man to help out. This man is a cemetery designer. They exhume all the bodies that have been buried, and he tries to make an effort to identify by name and rank all of the bodies, and they do a pretty good job of that. And then they bury. He starts supervising the burial. And when you go to Gettysburg and you see that burial, it is amazing because it looks like a big teardrop of Union soldiers and then a big teardrop of Confederate soldiers, and it looks like a weaving rope. And as I stood there and looked at that, all I could think about was that wonderful quote by Henry V in Shakespeare's play Henry V after the Battle of Agincourt, when he's given the statistics of the battle, and Henry says, "This indeed was a royal fellowship of death." And it really, really was. It was amazing. Okay, fine. Let's have a cemetery dedication. Okay, then let's invite the best speaker of the time. Okay, then let's invite Edward Everett. He is the number one greatest speaker of the century, and everybody knows that. He had been a cabinet member. He had been a representative to Great Britain. He had been a member of the House of Representatives. He had been a president at Harvard. He had also spoken over 100 times on George Washington and took all the money that he made and donated it to a committee that bought Mount Vernon so that we can now go see Mount Vernon. Yes, he's a big deal. And they invite him to come and speak. And then afterwards, somebody says, "Well, is there anybody else we should invite?" No. And somebody said, "Well, it's a federal cemetery. Maybe we should invite the president." The president? Why? Who wants him? You need to go back and look at the political cartoons of the time, and you'll see Lincoln pictured as a baboon, as a turtle, as a dog, as a fish, as all kinds of lower life form animals. He was not respected at all during the Civil War. And they wrote him a letter, and in that letter it says, "Dear Mr. Lincoln, will you please come and add a few," and they underlined the word few several times, "appropriate remarks." And in his classy way, he responded back and said, "I would be honored to come and be a part of your cemetery dedication." So both men came. And it came that morning of the dedication. And we're going to have a volunteer to help me show you. Now, can you turn him around so he's facing toward me?
Yeah.
There. You just face me. I'm going to show you a copy of Edward Everett's speech. Now, hold it up.
Oh my God.
See, I wasn't kidding. It took him 2 hours and 45 minutes to give it. When he got introduced, the introduction took 15 minutes. The applause took 15 minutes because everybody's so thrilled they can brag that I got to hear Edward Everett speak. And please remember, these people are standing the whole time. And if you look in this speech, up in here, he talks about the Egyptians and the Persians and the Medes and the Romans and the Greeks. And he finally gets up into the Reformation time. Way down in here, you don't have to fold it, just hang on. He gets way down into the American Revolution. And then down in here, he gets to the point where he's talking about Gettysburg. Thank you. That's it. Appreciate your help. There we go. Thank you very much. And then the individual conducting the meeting stands up and says, "We will now hear a few words from the President of the United States," and sits down. And the applause lasted almost 10 seconds. Okay. And Lincoln stood up, and he caught his breath, and then looked out, and he gave that famous speech. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the entire speech. That's Lincoln's speech. Aren't you glad that you could memorize this when you didn't have to memorize Edward Everett's? Okay? 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And now we're engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are gathered on a great battlefield of that war, to dedicate as a final resting place those who gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we do so. In a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. These brave men who struggled here have consecrated it far beyond our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it will never forget what they did here. And I'm going to stop right there and say, Mr. Lincoln, you're wrong. Sir, you're wrong. And this is why. This is why. I hate to think Abraham Lincoln was wrong about anything, but anyway, he's wrong about this. Why? Because of this line. It says, the world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. Ladies and gentlemen, if I ask you for details about Gettysburg, if I ask you, name the generals on both sides, name the units of military function on both sides, give me details of battle and movements and any detail about it. How far is Gettysburg as the battle from the town? Give me any detail. Nobody is going to be able to come up with anything. If I ask you something about the Gettysburg, I know the Gettysburg Address. That's Lincoln. Lincoln wasn't even the main speaker. He was an afterthought. And isn't that interesting? The next day in the newspaper, as he's speaking and he's finishing speaking, there was applause. That was pretty much it. The next day in the newspaper, the Baltimore Sun said, Lincoln's speech wasn't too bad. Every other newspaper in America demanded his impeachment immediately because it was so embarrassing that a president of the United States could only talk for 2.5 minutes. How humiliating is that? We can't have someone like that represent America. And a week later, a letter arrived at the White House from Edward Everett. Mr. Everett said, Dear Mr. Lincoln, I would flatter myself to think that I got as close to the point in 2.5 hours as you did in 2.5 minutes. And Mr. Lincoln wrote back and said, Dear Mr. Everett, you could not have been forgiven for giving a shorter speech, nor could have I been forgiven for giving a longer speech, but thank you for your kind words. Lincoln went to his death a 1.5 years later, firmly convinced that the Gettysburg Address was the biggest embarrassment of his political career. He was horrified at how it was received. Today, we think it's one of the finest things ever written. And that's why I keep sending emails saying, please, Mr. Lincoln, understand. No, we value what you did. We really, really do. And when you go to Gettysburg, it is literally amazing. Get a docent, have them get in your car, drive it around. They'll tell you everything about the battle. The battlefield is 7 miles long and 3.5 miles wide. They've got a lot of stories. It's worth it. Every dime, it's worth it. It is amazing. In 1864, Lincoln wrote this letter that I need to read to you so that you can begin to understand the depth of the magnitude of the man. It is a letter he wrote to Mrs. Bixby in Massachusetts. And he said, "Dear Madam, I have been shown in the file of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who died gloriously in battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any word of mine which should attempt to beguile you from the grief of a loss so overwhelming. But I cannot refrain from tendering you the consolation that must be found in the thanks of the Republic that they died to save. I pray that our Heavenly Father will assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only with the cherished memory of the loved and the lost and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom." I can't even fathom going through that and then this woman receiving such a letter. Oh my goodness. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. In 1864, everybody was convinced that Lincoln was going to lose. He was running against his former general, General McClellan. General McClellan may have been the best general we've ever had to organize troops and the poorest general we've ever had to lead troops into battle. And how crazy is that? In September, it looked like Lincoln was going to lose of 1864. McClellan wanted to declare peace immediately and everybody go back home and everybody can have their own country and do what you want to do. And Lincoln said, no, we're not going to do that. Not even going to consider doing that. And toward the end of October, General Sherman finished marching through Georgia and even Atlanta. Do you remember the opening scene in the movie Gone with the Wind? That's what that's about. Sherman burned a 100 miles wide swath of land clear up through the length of Georgia. It's why in Georgia, the name Sherman is still a swear word. And you think the Civil War is over? Not in the South. It's not. Anyway, Sherman said, I'm presenting Atlanta to you. And then Lincoln actually won the race. Between the election of 1864 and the next spring of 1865, all kinds of events took place, some major battles in Virginia, Spotsylvania Courthouse and Cold Harbor and several other places that have incredible stories all their own. And then Lee leaves and goes to Petersburg and that defensive trench warfare there for 9 months. And then Lee leaves and goes to Richmond and starts west. And he's finally captured in March of 1865 and asks for terms and writes a letter to Grant. Can we meet and can we have terms? This is Wilmer McLean's home in Appomattox. And they met around the kitchen table. When Lee walked in to meet Grant, Grant was never one for propriety. Grant showed up at that meeting wearing a private's uniform. Lee, on the other hand, was always the epitome of class and well-dressed, and he had creases in his pants and his boots were shined, and he just looked wonderful. And he walked up and shook their hands, and Grant said, General Lee, do you remember who I am? And General Lee said, And it turns out, and Grant started to explain it to him, it turns out that they had both fought in the Mexican War, and Lee was a star in the Mexican War, and Grant was kind of a coming up, but nowhere near the magnitude of Lee. And they had met. And Grant tried to remind Lee of that, and Lee, in his kind way, said, General Grant, I'm sorry, I've had a lot on my mind lately. I really don't remember, and I'm sorry. I really don't remember. And then they sat down, and Grant, to his credit, when terms were asked for, Grant said, all of your men can keep their sidearms, they can keep their horses, and they can keep mementos, but they can't keep battle flags, and they can't keep the large weaponry like cannons and things like that, cannonballs. And that was very kind. And so the surrender took place on that Friday afternoon and on the 9th. And then on the next Monday, Lincoln went to Richmond and walked the streets of Richmond. And the African American community came from every direction and embraced him and thanked him for what he had done. But nobody knew that the story wasn't done. Then we have this idiot. Okay? Now, my definition of an idiot, you need to hear that. My definition of an idiot is anybody that changes history with the course of a gun. Once that takes place, they don't have the right to have their name, and even I have a hard time even showing the picture. Because every time you do, you're aggrandizing the individual and what they have done. If our media simply understood that and stopped doing that, the 15 minutes of fame would be taken away. And much of the violence would go away. But our media doesn't get it. They just flat don't get it. Anyway, this man was one of the great actors of the century. His father is still considered the greatest Shakespearean actor of the 1800s. Lincoln had attended a play in 1862 on Broadway that he was in. Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln went to New York and attended a Broadway play. And Lincoln wrote a letter and asked him if they could meet. And he wrote a letter back, and a note back, and said, oh, it's not convenient. I'm sorry. Lincoln never did know that the individual hated Lincoln. As the war is winding down, he has decided that he's going to create a group, and they're going to kidnap Lincoln, and then they're going to exchange Lincoln for prisoners of war, so the Confederate Army can still fight on. They thought they could get 10,000 soldiers for exchange for Lincoln. And instead, all of a sudden, the war ended. And that surprised him. And then, on that Friday afternoon, Lincoln announced that he and his wife and another couple were going to go to see a play in Ford's Theater. And this is Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. And you can still go there. It's a beautiful theater. Seats over 1,800 people. And they were going to go see a play. And they came walking up, and they sat in the booth up in here. And then the idiot came around behind them about a half hour later and came up behind them, and with a double-barreled Derringer that's about this big, and I know that because I've seen it. If you go there, go downstairs. They've got a little museum that's about the size of this room. All of Lincoln's clothing, except his shirt, is in there. And also the little gun that the idiot used. And he came up and shot Lincoln right about in here. And Lincoln is sitting there, and all of a sudden went, ah. His chin drops to his chest, and that's the last audible sound Lincoln made. Major Rathbone, who was the bodyguard of Lincoln, had been a bodyguard for several years and knew better, but didn't bring any weaponry. It's peace. Shouldn't be a problem. And he jumps up at the idiot. And the idiot's so startled he drops the gun. He pulls out a giant Bowie knife and starts swinging it at Rathbone. And in one of the swings, hits Rathbone. It cuts him open from the inside of his wrist, across his arm, across his chest, clear down to the inside of the other wrist, and he just starts gushing blood and collapses. He does eventually recover from that, but, oh my goodness, it was horrible. And then the idiot jumps up on the stand, jumps down, it's about 12 feet, lands down here, screaming out, Sic semper tyrannis, which is Latin for thus it shall ever be with tyrants, and runs out into the night and hops on his horse and gets away. And it begins the largest manhunt in American history to that time. this is an outstanding book about that time period, and it's about the 12 days. It tells all kinds of detail about the assassination, and then it tells the 12 days about the hunting for the idiot and how he was found and what happened. And it is a wonderful, wonderful story. Now, what happened was America the next day woke up to this, and the newspapers were screaming, and everybody was in shock. Lincoln that night was carried across the street. They sent somebody, they knew they couldn't get him to a hospital. They sent him across the street, and they started banging on doors. The body was taken over because one door opened up. And you can still go to the Peterson home, and you can walk down that long hallway, and you can walk into that back bedroom, and you can see the bed that Lincoln was laid on. And that bed would have been perfectly comfortable if you were 5'5" or shorter. And Lincoln was 6'4". And so they laid him diagonally across it, and early the next morning, Lincoln passed away. And that's when his Secretary of State, Edwin Stanton, said those immortal words that now he belongs to the ages. And he really, really did. The idiot and his co-conspirators were all found and brought to trial and executed. And you might think that that person in the middle is female. She is. It's the first time a woman was ever found guilty of a capital crime and was executed in American history. Her name is Mary Surratt. Now, they put the body on the train, and they're just going to drive the train back to Springfield and bury the body. America said, "No, you're not. We want to see and say goodbye." And so they put Lincoln's casket in the train, and they exhumed Willie's casket and put them in the train to take them back and bury them both in the family plot in Springfield. That train, instead of taking the 3.5 days to get from Washington to Springfield, it took 20 days. And they went, that map, if you look at a map, they just go all over the place because everybody wanted to say goodbye to their president. This is what the train looks like today. It's in a museum in Baltimore. And you can go see the museum. And you can see the train. And they took him to Springfield in that beautiful rendering there, and he is buried there. And then we're going to go back just briefly to the Lincoln Monument. The columns all the way around represent the number of states when he was President of the United States. If you go, make sure and come down and go around over here. There's another little museum down underneath there as part of that. And that museum is it's a one room, and it's about this big. And they have some very interesting things there. This is a shorter look. In this temple, as in the hearts of the people of whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever. And it is absolutely incredible, the effect that he had. And the story ends here with this man. This is his surviving son. This man's name was Robert Todd Lincoln. This Mr. Lincoln was 17 when his father was shot and killed. And the night his father was dying, he was found in the White House in front of a very large fireplace throwing boxes of paper into the fireplace. And he was asked what he's doing. And he said, "These are my father's private papers. No one will ever know my father, Abraham Lincoln." We have no idea what was burned that night. Fast forward to 1881. He is now the secretary to President James Garfield. Garfield has left town briefly and has come home, and he's getting off the train in that huge Washington, D.C. train station depot. And he gets off the train, and he's walking toward Lincoln. And Lincoln can see him, and they're waving, and they're walking together, and all of a sudden, an idiot jumps out of the crowd and shoots Garfield. And Lincoln watches that. And Garfield dies of that. Fast forward 20 years, 1901. We're now in Buffalo, New York. It is the Pan American Conference, and countries from all over the world have come to see what America is doing in this new century. President William McKinley has been asked to come and speak, and he gives a great speech. And he comes down off of the podium, and he walks down in the audience. He's standing there. This Lincoln is a member of the cabinet, and he's sitting on the stand, 20 feet from the president, as the president is shaking hands, and an idiot jumps out with a gun and shoots McKinley. He never married because he was afraid he was going to pass on the family curse of blackness or darkness or depression. I can't imagine mentally what he lived through. But the important thing to know, he was there in 1921 when the Lincoln Monument was dedicated. When he died in 1922, he was the last direct connection to Lincoln. And the Lincoln line died out with his death. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here and hearing about Abraham Lincoln.